Ghana is set to have access to some $360 million upon completion of an executive board review of the IMF. Now, this follows that staff level agreement, and discussions have continued. We bring you a conversation on that. Let me just sneak in as well. I've got some calls and messages, a number of you trying to join the live stream on Joy News on Facebook. We're facing some challenges specifically on Facebook. So if you can't connect, don't worry. Our technical team is on that. They are handling it. And as and when we reconnect, you'll be sure to know about that. But let me now introduce the guests who joined me on this all-important conversation. Our economy is primus inter pares for many people where we find ourselves. Seth Terkper is a former finance minister. He joins the conversation. We also have Dr. Theo Acheampong, a political risk analyst. And we also have, joining the conversation, Professor Elikblim Komla Agbloyo. He's a professor of finance at the University of Ghana Business School. Gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
Okay, so I think, okay, now I see Seth Terkper. Seth, you may have to unmute. Can you hear me, Mr. Terkper? All right. And then Dr. Theo Acheampong, can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can hear you. Morning.
Great. Good to have all of you.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, loud and clear. We're very appreciative of the fact that wherever you are, you've taken the time to discuss with us this morning. But I'll start with your initial thoughts on the IMF, our program, which the IMF is bankrolling, facilitating. It's been a while now, first tranche, second tranche. Now here we are with a top-up of $360 million that we're expecting. We're going through the motions. What is your reading of where we are currently? I'll start with you, Dr. Theo Acheampong, before I go to Seth Terkper and then Prof as well. Dr. Theo Acheampong.
Yes, again, Ben, a pleasure to be here. So I think generally the program has delivered on the broad structural and quantitative objectives. So if you look at the criteria that the fund used to do the assessment of the second review, and if you go to the big document that they published about a year ago, by the end of September, they were to have had some strategy to streamline a number of the statutory funds. We're supposed to also have had the medium-term revenue strategy approved, and then there's other things to do with the integrated tax administration system, and then expansion of GIFMIS to cover 265 other relevant authorities or institutions that generate their own IGFs or internally generated fund. And then there's a couple of other things to do with inflation and the deficit, and things to also do with the exchange rate and reserves. And if you look at all of those indicators, largely as of the end of last year, they had begun to improve in relative terms, still nowhere near the levels that we should be, but it did indicate that as for the second review, the performance under the program, as the bank itself says, has been strong. Of course, the challenge, which we will come to, I'm sure, later in this discussion, is one or two very sticky areas. So, for example, in the energy sector, with what's happening at ECG and the debate now whether it's doom or not, and the inefficiencies that's happening. Also, the cocoa sector, which is also a big issue as well. And then the third challenge really being whether or not, despite what the finance minister says, they would be able to contain spending in the election year. But I think overall, from where we sit now, like I said, they have met most of the targets.
Thank you, Dr. Theo Acheampong, for those initial comments. Let me bring in Seth Terkper. Your reading of the issues, development so far.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. As Dr. Theo Acheampong, mentioned, we may be doing well in the interim, in the short term, which is what the program, covers. We may be doing well in terms of particularly the structural and quantitative, the more immediate criteria that are set. I would caution that even if you look at the program itself, the task ahead is daunting, and I don't use that word advisedly. And that is because if you look at the program, the performance criteria 1 is based on primary balance. The calculation of a primary balance, and let me try to simplify it, simply means that you are calculating your expenditure, your deficit, which is your expenditure less your revenue, excluding interest payments. Okay. One, the problem we have itself is debt. And we are excluding one of the critical criteria for calculating, for resolving that problem out of the computation. Secondly, when you use the primary balance instead of the fiscal balance, you are excluding arrears. You would agree with me that another significant problem that we have, including the energy sector and the likely accumulation of more debt in that sector, in addition to the IPPs who are old and the rest, we are excluding that as well. And then finally, we are the calculation of primary balance, even the fiscal balance, excludes amortization, right? Sorry, the primary balance excludes amortization. We include, that is the repayment of debt. So when it comes to debt again, all that we are benefiting from now is a suspension of the debt, as a result of which the fund's own calculation from 2025 onwards keeps the debt at 80% plus. And it is only when we are getting into 2028 that the debt goes down to 77%. So the program trajectory itself, right, is not something which should make us complacent with respect to short-term achievements. Why do I say that? Even if you achieve a debt at 70%, you are still outside, the comfortable zone in which you would return to the markets, and assuming you will return to the market and borrow at sustainable rates to be able to finance the deficit.
Hello, Mr. Tekpe. All right. We'll get back to him.
The domestic financial markets. My last point. Because of the absence of access to the long-term market, both domestic and external, we are relying on trial balance to finance the deficit dangerously. That has its own danger, which I believe we can discuss in more detail as we go along. So I like us, as Ghanaians, to look at the need for us to do more for ourselves beyond what the program, is projecting for us, particularly in the short term, because the medium-term prospects, according to the data published by the fund, is still daunting from 2025 onwards.
All right. Thank you for those initial comments. Let me come to Prof. Agboyo. Your take on developments so far. What is your reading of the issues?
Okay. Good morning once again to you and your listeners. And yeah, I agree with my fellow speakers, Theo and Steph. I think that, we've demonstrated progress for us to achieve the SLA. And this SLA will unlock a further $360 million, bringing the total to about $1.56 billion. And that's almost 50% of the promised $3 billion under the ECF agreement. So far, I think we've done well. We've met most of the quantitative targets. Economic growth has been stronger than expected. The fiscal deficit has improved. Inflation has trended downwards from about 54.1%. Our reserve positions have also improved significantly. So this demonstrates progress under the program. But for me, the key risk now is geopolitical risks, okay? Especially given the issues taking place in the Middle East. So if we are not lucky and there's further escalation between Israel and Iran, we could see consequences for the Ghanaian economy, particularly because the dollar is likely to appreciate, given that the dollar is a safe haven currency. When there's crisis, sometimes even crisis originating from the US, people run to the dollar. Okay, and if the dollar appreciates, that is going to put further pressure on our currency. Again, given that a lot of oil is sourced from the Middle East, okay, we are likely to see oil prices also increasing, and that could cause further problems for us. Again, gold prices are likely to increase because gold also serves as a safe haven asset, which may in some way be good for us. But additionally, if there is further escalation in the Middle East, Iran may block the Strait of Hormuz, which may lead to supply chain disruptions and can lead to increases in prices in a lot of consumer goods and services. So for me, at the moment, that's the major risk that can derail what we have achieved so far. In addition, we know that this year is also an election year, and I think so far the government has been measured in its expenditure, trying to keep expenditure under control. And the finance minister said that he will hold the line. I think so far they are doing that very well. But let's hope that they keep it up and we don't have further escalation in the Middle East. So those would be my initial reactions.
I'm coming back to you, Prof, on two major issues, but one merging with what you just mentioned, because we just heard, the finance minister has been saying that his ministry will not embark on any extra budgetary spending. In other words, they are going to rein extra spending in. They are going to try to curb that. That has been one of the banes of our economy, even leading to what we all know, where the budget must always be financed externally, at least to some extent. But the two issues I want to run by you, though I want you to go there as well. Seth Tekma made mention of the fact that so far we had done somewhat well in the short term in terms of the requirements we had to reach vis-a-vis the IMF. But moving forward, the medium to long term is where the devil is. And finally, on the point about Iran and Israel, right? The US, you would notice, has already tightened the screw. Its currency is on the ascendancy again, which is why our currency is depreciating. Now, if Israel and Iran goes the way that no one wants it to go to, there is a further escalation. The Israelis are saying they will also reply, or there will be a reprisal for the Iranians. You're saying that we are going to suffer even more by way of the cedi depreciating even further. Just clarify those points for me.
Explain a bit more. In terms of the global financial architecture, the dollar is one of the major reserve currencies. When there's risk in the financial system, people buy the dollar as a hedge against instability in the financial system. And when a lot of people are buying the dollar, it means that the dollar is going to appreciate because of the high demand. It's like when people demand more tomatoes, tomato prices will go up. So when we demand more of the dollar, that is going to increase the price of the dollar. And that means that our cedi is going to depreciate further. And that can cause significantly more problems for us.
Dr. Theo Champon, let me come to you on those same points. I don't know whether you have any reactions and what could be the consequences if this were to happen and the cedi depreciated further. Because look, we even pegging it at the dollar, we hit 16 plus, and then it started coming down, came down to about 11, in some cases 10, and now it's hovering close to 14 again. What could be the consequences of saying?
Yeah, Alec Clem is absolutely right on that point, that the major headwind that we've got to deal with now is what happens on the external front. No two ways about that. And if you see what happened in the last couple of days, and again, you could go back to October 7th with the Hamas issue. If we see another reaction from Israel, and that escalates more into a regional war, right, or regional conflict, then what you end up actually doing is oil prices will actually spike up through the roof. And this morning, I've seen some analysts actually calling as much as $100 to $120 a barrel, right? What that does really is to hammer an economy such as, Ghana. So yes, we will benefit in terms of our oil exports, but particularly given that what we actually get, ourselves is less than what we are spending to import finished product and all of that, it's going to have a ripple effect on inflation, on cost of living, and then a lot of the criteria that we've even set, even on growth, right, GDP growth, a lot of the criteria that we've set in the IMF program would not be met, and that's a major concern that I'm sure a lot of the managers of the economy are having to deal with in terms of what happens in the Middle East and the geopolitics, around that. I think there are three other things, some of which Seth talks about: the need or the urgency to get the debt treatment right going. So we signed the MOU in January, all well and good, but we have not done the individual country or bilateral signings on the bilateral component of the debt. That's one. The more important one also is the actual external commercial debt restructuring, the $13 billion. If you do recall, the government said that by the end of March this year, they would have made progress on that. We are actually, today is the 15th of April, and not much progress has been made on that front. And I suspect we may not be able to conclude on that probably until about latter part of this year, August or September, thereabout. And then related to that is what happens with the arrears that we have been accruing. Because yes, you do the debt calculations, you still have arrears that are not being fully reflected in some of the debt numbers. And then the last point, which I would kind of mention as also another factor to watch, is what happens in the financial sector, the banking sector, right? We've seen some of the banks and the non-NPLs, the non-performing loan ratios, begin to creep up again, despite the government intent of setting up that 1 billion financial sector stability fund. We want to see more details in terms of its rollout and what that would do to help mitigate, right, some of the pressures that the banks are facing. So these are like four big things that we've got to contend with over the next 6 months to 1 year. What happens on the external front? What happens with the MOU or the debt treatment, the commercial debt restructuring, particularly the $13 billion of Eurobonds, the financial sector, and then we'll talk about the SOEs, which is a big, sticky point, particularly in the energy space.
Right. Do hold for me. And Seth Takpe, I'm coming to you on some of those points. But first, I'll definitely come to you on the external front, what we're doing in terms of debt treatment and the missed deadlines, among others. But first, I'd like to run by you this post by Joe Jackson, which I spotted yesterday, of Dalex Finance. And he says, IMF reaches staff-level agreement on second review of Ghana's ECF. This, by the way, was on X. And he said this should bring some relief to the cedi, which has suffered significant depreciation of about 8.5% in the first 3 months of the year. Do you feel that this will bring the sort of relief that Joe Jackson is expectant it will? I just want your brief take on that before we go to the other substantive issues.
Yes, on that point, we have had $600 million US injected into the economy by the IMF. We have had the World Bank and African Development Bank injecting some budget support. And by the way, we have had to use, part of the IMF money for budgetary needs and not in support of, BOG's balance of payment, which is what we normally do with IMF money. So the question is, what impact will 300 million, have? I'm afraid it's not going to be that significant because one of the points we need to note is that the cocoa sector is not bringing in, or it's not likely to bring in as much reserves despite the high cocoa price. And then in relation to the global context, just one point on that. As the dollar strengthens, gold weakens, and that also, affects us. And then the point about petroleum has already been made, particularly on the domestic sector and its impact on growth, the energy sector's impact on growth. So I would, that's why I like to draw attention to the medium term. We need to have our own permanent sources of, generating more foreign forex. And this is one area in which, for the non-traditional sector of the economy, the then Mahama administration introduced the Exim Bank, which was to act like the cocoa board for the non-traditional sector, but so far has been focused, on domestic, more on domestic. So that's the point I can make, on your question.
All right.
The medium term for me is very important.
Right. But let's talk about the external debt framework. At a point in time, we were told about China, that big elephant in the room, and some agreements in the pipeline. But when you look at our debt restructuring from that point, that is where the devil seems to be. We've missed our deadlines, and now, as we know, the IMF is not giving us any more money until we receive assurances from bondholders in respect of, some of these debts that we have to rein in. How difficult will it be to reach these agreements with bondholders, both locally, because there have been other attempts, and externally in terms of our debt?
How difficult has it been? And then we come to how difficult will it be? Remember that even going to the board was delayed for a while until the chairman for the bilateral group, which is France and China, provided a special waiver. And that's the only way in which we went to the board. The first review was also held in abeyance because we had not concluded at the time the MOU for the bilateral loans. Again, that was agreed in principle, and the details were to be worked out. So we have now in the release, the staff level agreement is conditional, because we are often elated by the fact that we have reached staff level agreement and don't look at the conditions, which is what happened, and the disappointment with many Ghanaians when the fund program itself, was agreed, and we kept saying that there are conditions for going to the board. Here again, we have the same MOU issue, which stalled the first, the first review, hanging over us. We are now to finalize that with the bilateral, the official, creditors. And let me explain. We have the domestic debt, restructuring, which we did, with pensioners and the rest, that to simplify it a bit for people to put it in context. And then the other category of debt, as a result of our default, which we have to restructure, is what we are talking about now. Loans that were given to us by governments. That's why we call it official, or bilateral. It's between Ghana and those governments. And this is where China and France come in on behalf, of those creditors. And because the fund itself, as a multilateral agency, the loan to the multilaterals, the IMF, the World Bank, African Development Bank, were not touched, and so we continue to benefit from them. But the IMF itself will not lend to a country that is bankrupt. That is one of the issues that we are dealing with, with this debt crisis. And so until we get over that hump, which had been suspended, or waived twice in going to the board, then we are stuck. And that is why there is the urgency. The Minister for Finance has assured, that agreement will be reached so that we can go to the board. In any event, because of the April spring meetings, usually the IMF board does not meet during its spring meetings in April and its annual meetings in October, because it is preoccupied with reporting to the world, and its members, including Ghana. So it's in itself, even if we reach those agreements, it is likely that unless there's a special sitting for Ghana, the board will meet only, in May, which is is closed by the most optimistic. The third category of the loan that we are battling with is the commercial. That is the one which involves the sovereign bonds that we issued and borrowing from banks, the private sector. And that is what, Prof mentioned, both of them mentioned, the two profs have mentioned, could drag, because we were told that we would be reaching some agreement with them, but it looks like the negotiations are not going as well. And there are issues that are tied between that and, what we were talking about earlier, which is the bilateral. Because the concessions that we get in the bilateral is likely to influence, those negotiations as well. So, in short, yes, we have defaulted. We are unable to service our debt. The suspensions are only suspensions. We are not getting any debt forgiveness because we are a middle income country and we may not. And so we see ourselves, tied our performance in even getting funds under the IMF program, the World Bank and others, being tied to these conditions.
Right. Mr. Tekwe, just hold for me. I'll be right back to you, gentlemen, to elaborate further on some of these points. We'll take a brief breather. We'll be right back on these economy-related issues, the IMF program, the $360 million, and what we can expect moving forward. We'll be right back. Welcome back after the break. I'd also like to welcome back Seth Tekwe, Dr. Theo Champong, and Professor Agboya. So, Mr. Tekwe, I was with you when you were making that point. Just to cap it all off on our debt restructuring. So it's going to be murkier than we see it. While the finance minister is saying that they are going to rein in spending and all of that, your projections then are what exactly in terms of the rest of our debt that we need to get restructured, without which not, we will not get further funding from the IMF. Your take is what exactly? And then we proceed from there. Can you hear me, Mr. Tekwe? Please unmute. Please unmute for me.
Apologies. My simple take is that we should work as expeditiously as possible on this matter because we have the experience of other countries like Zambia and the rest, which took nearly 2 years for them to resolve the issue that we are discussing. Because negotiations with creditors is not that easy. Even when we did a 2015 bond, if you remember, the entire bond was used to refinance, our short-term doom, so single spine and then looming 200 million of the then looming first sovereign bond, which was waiting for us. We had used reserved 550 million, of our own oil, revenue to take it off, but we had a 200 million, which was added. And this involved in the World Bank, which is very sympathetic to developing countries. That discussion itself took quite a bit. So we have our own experience, and we have the experience of other countries to show that debt restructuring is not as optimistic as we were made to believe. And that is what we are facing. But I still believe that, within the Ministry of Finance, Bank of Ghana and others, there are staff, who would complement the effort, of the minister who have experience. That's the point. Often when we are discussing these issues, we don't mention the public officers because of what we know about the public, sector, which is often not so, palatable. But also, we have external advisors, who are helping. Some of them have assisted us in the past, pro bono, even though we've never acknowledged it in public. I think it's about time to say that within Ghana, you have, Barclays, Sanchez, Stambik, and others who often have reached out to their experts in London and elsewhere, Dubai, to assist us in our debt negotiations. And I believe that is still ongoing. So from that perspective, we will. But the issue of debt, let us remember, that would be my point on this. Again, I go back to the medium term. Let us remember that our debt will dip slightly because it is suspended, and because we do not account for all our liabilities, not just arrears to suppliers and the rest. It will look as if the debt has gone down. But as the IMF projection mentions, which I mentioned at the beginning, of my submissions, the medium term will show that it will go up again, because if it is suspended, by the time the suspension ends in 2026, 2027, thereabout, it will come back to add to the debt. And that is where I believe even when the managing director of the IMF came together, this was discussed. And the disclosure was that we could still be in the upper 80s or lower 90s, 90% of GDP, which will not be good for us, in our effort to secure long-term financing. That is another important point. The fact that we are relying on short-term debt, a 3-month instrument, the treasury bill, to finance our budget. Every 3 months, what it means in principle is that we should pay what we borrowed in 3 months. We are not paying. We are taking more money, to pay off what should be. That is replacing debt with debt. Refinancing is okay, but we are not reducing the debt. And so the debt dimension, this is another dimension of the debt, which is that our reliance on a 3-month instrument. If you took it that we started relying on the treasury bill, which is a 3-month instrument, a 91-day instrument, from late last year, we would have had 3 quarters already, by June, where we have borrowed, and instead of paying, we are adding. The interest rate is high, and often we use that debt which we borrowed at a high interest rate to repay debt which we borrowed at a lower interest rate, which should be the reverse, the restructuring. So this is another dimension of the debt situation, which I want to point out.
And thank you for adding that dimension, that layer to the conversation. Let me bring in Professor Agloyo. On 2 points, Seth Tekpe says the debt restructuring is not as optimistic as we've been made to believe, which also begs the question about the IMF, the Bretton Woods institutions, and whether sometimes, Seth said, they tend to be sympathetic towards developing countries. But does that sympathy often also result in misplaced optimism, where they are saying things that are not necessarily the true picture on the ground? How do you address these 2 concerns, Prof?
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll just make a few comments and then I'll come to your question. So sure. I agree with John Jackson that all else equal, the $360 million should reduce pressure on the cedi. But in the real world, everything is not equal. So we have headwinds in the Middle East. The size of the $360 million itself is not very huge, given, for example, the demand of dollars in the economy, etc. So that would be my first reaction. In terms of the medium term, I agree with Seth, we need to be more measured. For me, critically, we need to improve our level of external reserves. Okay, currently, it stands about 1.7 months of import cover. For me, that is dangerously low. Okay, even for individuals, the usual recommendation is that you should have at least income covering 6 months of your living expenses. So for me, our import cover level should be a minimum of 6 to 12 months import cover. If you ask me, it should be even minimum of 12 months import cover. That allows you to withstand global economic shocks. If you look at what happened during COVID-19, etc., countries with high levels of external reserves did not suffer as much as we did. So for me, in terms of shock-proofing the economy going forward, we should probably consider very seriously improving our foreign exchange reserves. We probably should put in place a policy as to the minimum level of external reserves that we want to have as a country. Then in terms of the debt treatment, one of the things that I will be looking out for is equity, okay, between domestic and foreign creditors. Domestic creditors took a huge hit, in many cases losing about almost 80% of their investment, okay? I think that even though we have foreign creditors who have more bargaining power, etc., we need to bargain harder and ensure that at the end of the debt treatment, our domestic investors don't come out worse compared to foreign investors. And then also going forward, I think we need to examine very seriously what I'll call a capital structure decision, okay? What should be the optimal level of external debt that we hold as a country? When we borrow externally, yes, it helps, but then we are committing what we call the original sin. We are borrowing in a currency that we do not control, we cannot print. And that can put us in trouble when we are in a financial crisis. So what percentage should we aim for in terms of the level of foreign debt compared to domestic debt? That should be a serious decision we should consider.
What do you think? What do you think? External debt vis-a-vis local debt. What should we be inching towards? If you were in the setup, if you were giving advice, what would you proffer? Briefly on that.
Well, I haven't. So usually I like to make recommendations based on empirical work. I haven't done any empirical work to determine an optimal ratio. But if you ask me to recommend something, I'll say 20 to 30 stroke 70 to 80. Maybe let me be clearer. So maybe 20% foreign, 80% domestic, or 30% foreign, 70% domestic. I think that is a more sustainable long-term ratio to have as a country.
All right.
And then to your question, yes, the IMF, World Bank, that's their work. They're supposed to help us when we're in trouble. That's what they were set up for. So yes, they tend to be sympathetic towards developing countries. That sometimes can lead to over-optimism. But I think that is what they are there for, to support us and to help us manage, for example, a balance of exchange crisis.
Yes, but they should also be able to look us in the face and tell us when things are going wrong, rather than wait till we're down in the valley and then they start. I mean, do you get the picture? Oftentimes they are accused of commending us, touting us until disaster strikes, when they know from our books that things are not going well. So that's why I was asking briefly about misplaced optimism. I remember speaking to the IMF boss over a year and a half ago, and that optimism did not resonate with Ghanaians when she said that, oh, Ghana is suffering from exogenous shocks, COVID-19, the Russo-Ukrainian war. We're still here. Look at where we are. So I don't know. Brief take on that, and then I'll focus on Dr. Thieu Acheampong.
Sure. So I think it's a balancing act, okay? The IMF is trying to reform its image. They've had a very treacherous past with African countries, from the economic adjustment programs in the 1980s, okay, structural adjustment programs in the 1980s. A lot of countries didn't want to even work with the IMF. So they are trying to reform their image to look more friendly to developing countries. So you can see it from me from that point of view. But they do need to look us in the face when things are not going well and tell us that you need to do A, B, C, D. Other than that, our support will be limited. So I think it's a fine balancing act that they will need to achieve going forward.
All right. Dr. Thieu Acheampong, now talking about their support being limited, the ground rules are clear. If you don't deal with the bondholders and get the assurances from them, there's no moving forward with getting more money from the IMF. Now, that is like getting cut at the knees, especially considering where we are. What does that mean? What does that picture really mean in terms of our economy and things getting better?
Very simple. It says that if you don't get the signing of the agreement, whatever you have reached with them earlier this year, the MOU, each and every one of those official creditors needs to sign on a paper that says, okay, we agreed with the broad terms and this is what we're going to give to you. We've not been able to do that in the level that is required. And until that is done, the release or the completion of the third review would be pending. And so the $300 million or 360 that you're expecting is not going to come. That is as clear as that. Right. And remember, we had a similar thing in last year. So originally, the second review was meant to have been completed in November of last year. And the condition was that at that point, you needed the MOU agreed. And there was the back and forth, and it had to take us until January, middle of January of this year, before that came through. Now they're saying that you've got the MOU, but you still need the individual bilateral creditors to sign and say, we agree to the terms of that MOU before we release that money. So if that delays, then basically the May deadline that you're looking at to get the $360 million coming in is not going to come in. Then further down the line, post-May, you also got the big issue with your commercial debt, that $13 billion of the Eurobonds that you've got to restructure. And this is where I like to cut the IMF and the World Bank a bit of slack. I think you used the word misplaced optimism. I think it's rather, for me, more on the side of the government, because we've always been very quick to announce.
So the misplaced optimism is more on the side of government, not the IMF.
On this particular issue of the debt restructuring, because it's the government that has gone to the market to say, we're going to get this thing done by this date, including for the external commercial. They said that by the end of March, and this is you can go check the budget statement and check other statements. It was quite clear. So when you communicate that and you're not able to deliver by those deadlines, and it's not just this example, there are numerous other examples that I can cite, right? Then you begin to signal to the market, right, a certain element of uncertainty. And this is where, like Seth and others have been saying, we need to exercise some level of restraint, particularly in terms of how over-optimistic often we are to announce certain things to the market. Because we've seen what's happened with Zambia, right? Back and forth, renegotiation. And even when they even got a deal with the commercial creditors, the official ones came and said, no, we don't agree to that. You're giving them too much of a haircut. And so we need to rework the numbers to meet the debt comparability rules or debt treatment rules, right? So that the private creditors are not, the public creditors are not subsidizing the private ones. These are very complex, complicated things that we're talking about here. So I think it's really on the part of the government to be a bit more measured in terms of what they communicate to the market, particularly, timelines that are not within their
control. Right.
Two other quick things.
So even as you give us those two other quick things, I would like to add this just because you've ended on that point. How difficult then do you think these attempts to reach an agreement with these bondholders will be? How difficult is it going to be? And that's a final question I'll throw to all three of you gentlemen, and then you can add your final comments and then wrap the conversation. So I'm starting with you, Dr. Theo Champong. How difficult or easy will it be to reach these agreements with the bondholders?
It's going to be difficult. Everybody is fighting their turf. Everybody wants to keep their corner. If you are the one that gave me money, right, as government of Ghana, you have fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders. You're not just writing off loans for the beauty of it. So you want to ensure that two things, you are covering your back, and whatever you give as relief to me in terms of haircuts in MPV terms or the face value terms, other lenders would also be giving the same thing so that there's equity in the treatment of the debt, like Eliklim was saying. So I think you probably are looking to about August or September before we get some sort of closure on that external commercial debt restructuring.
August or September.
Zambia example, yes, unlike the Zambia example, you're going to maybe have two flavors. One where the debt repayment will be much bigger should the economy perform more. And then the other one, which will be like a baseline. And we don't have time to get into the details. But I think two other really quick things to mention is on the reserves position that, again, Eliklim talked about. It's important to remember that a year and a half ago, almost a year ago, we're down to 2 weeks of import cover of reserves. And now we've come up to a little over 1.5 months or so. We should be around 3 months in terms of the safety.
But if memory serves, recently we were around 3 months and it dipped at a point again. It dipped.
Then we came all the way down to 2 weeks of import cover. Literally, we're almost broke in very simple terms. Yeah.
Right.
But this going forward, this is why I think some of the gold purchase program or the other asset purchase program of the central bank becomes extremely important.
Are you referencing gold for oil? Is that what you're referencing?
Gold for oil is different. You're
referencing the other one? Okay, right.
Purchase program that the central bank is doing. That would help in terms of having alternative, currencies as a store or measure to bolster the reserve. The last point I want to mention is an important point that the IMF mentioned during Saturday's meeting, the recapitalization of the central bank, right? So we know that close to 60 or so billion was spent to support the government, print money and all of that. And there has to be an MOU signed to the effect that will allow the Treasury to pay back the central bank some amount in order to rebuild their balances. That's also something we need to look out for.
Thank you for those points. Have you concluded? I mean, with your... All right, I think this is what I'm going to do. I'll come back to you for about another 30 seconds and that's it. Seth Tekpe, on that same point, how difficult or easy is it going to be negotiating, finding our way through this maze as far as the bondholders are concerned?
As I stated, how difficult, how easy, we should look at the experience of other countries. We are not unique when it comes to these things. And therefore, for as long as countries have been negotiating for a very long time, there were countries that were negotiating during the debt suspension, COVID. And it took a long while. A few of them have still not, completed. That's how long it can take. Why? That's because, remember, when a foreign government gives you loan, it is from its taxpayers. And just as when we take loans, we say that we need the discipline of our representatives and we go to parliament, part of what is happening is that they have to go back to parliament on the new terms and conditions. If it was Ghana that was doing it, we would have been varying the terms and conditions of the loan under, with a haircut, with extension, suspension, and all that, under the Constitution. And we would have been compelled to go back to Parliament and Article 1815, if I may draw that analogy to understand why sometimes you have these delays. For the commercial loans, in terms of, they are market people. There are people who trade in loans. That's what it means, and their performance depends on the interest that they earn. If you go and you are asking for a waiver of that, it is affecting their bottom line, as they say. And their reflection on the market will look back, and therefore they will negotiate real hard, to make sure that, they are not giving away. So these things are not, these are some of the reasons why these negotiations, take a long time. But let me just mention that we have been emphasizing debt, and that is really so. But where does debt come from? Debt comes from borrowing. And where does borrowing come from? Borrowing comes from the deficit, the difference between your revenue and expenditure. And therefore, we do not have time to go into that. But we must take, the reforms in strengthening our revenue handles seriously. The number of taxes are just too many. We know already, and that has been discussed. So until we are able to reduce our deficit, if you look at the IMF program, it talks about ITAS. What is ITAS? ITAS is the domestic, the automation or digitalization, if I may use that word, of the domestic tax regime, which was to complement, single window, if you remember, West Blue, or now ICOMS.
Right.
For 7 years, it wasn't done. Now it has become a conditionality. This was going to be phase 2 of the ICOM, so that you can interface the domestic tax system, with the external, and then make it, more efficient. Expenditure. We have not mentioned expenditure rationalization, reduction. Sometimes there has never been an IMF program among the 17 that we have not tackled expenditure. Here we are keeping expenditure. Where the minister has said that they will hold the line. Hold the line on what? Hold the line on an expenditure level that is already high, and this may be the only IMF program where expenditure has not, been taken quite seriously. As a result of this,
and who is to blame for that? Who is to blame for that? The IMF or our own,
we
end
have
of
to
things?
blame ourselves, because what are we talking about? We're talking basically about gift miss, which today is there, accounts payable. There was an initiative, you can go back to POOFMAP if you want to, not to be partisan about this issue. POOFMAP from the Rawlings era, to the Kufuor era, and then to Mills, Mahama, and then we adopted the expression gift miss. That's what it is, to improve our expenditure management. Today, again, after 7 years, it is another conditionality which we must meet.
Right.
Why couldn't we do these things for ourselves?
Right.
So my final point is, you can't keep borrowing and expect people to forgive, to suspend. You must learn to repay. And that is why, under the homegrown, we brought a sinking fund, right? Again, it is as decimated as a stabilization fund. Today we would have gone into the stabilization fund to stabilize or to hold the budget deficit, which is the one that causes borrowing and debt,
right.
On account of the global crisis that we are talking about. You see, we are facing another global crisis. And I've been saying that you will not run an economy continuously for 3 years without one crisis or the rest, the flooding right. and all those things. And that is why you need that stabilization fund when the times are good, when you have 3 oil fields, so that you can use to stabilize. So in short, we need our own short-term measures, but we need to deepen our structural, measures such as the one. Eloquent Prof mentioned, the balance between the domestic and the external. That was the essence of putting the government bonds on the stock exchange so that it becomes marketable. Yes, we were balancing it. It was very new, but it became the largest fixed income market of the stock exchange. What have we done with it? We stopped the payment. We ran it down. And those who would patronize that domestic market, pension funds and the rest, today they've been hurt, households. Right. How do you require another rebuilding of confidence? That was the essence of putting the government bonds on the market so that we can grow the domestic debt market. That's the simple explanation for that exercise, which itself has been established.
Thank you, Mr. Thekpe. Let me bring in Professor Agboyo. You have the final word on this, and then if there's anything little to add, we can add that. If not, we can draw the curtains of the conversation. Prof.
Sure. So, I do agree perfectly with Seth that we need to learn from the experience of other countries so that we don't make similar mistakes. For me, I think that there's some level of agreement between creditors, us and the creditors, and that shouldn't make it too difficult to finalize an agreement.
Okay, all right. Brief words. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Just a few
okay,
more.
Go ahead.
Especially, we need to consider equity, again, between official creditors and commercial creditors, domestic creditors, and all.
We'll try and wait for Prof. I mean, he's waited patiently for the others to speak. We'll just try one more time. Hopefully, the internet connection helps. Prof, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
But for me, critically going forward, we need to build our reserves. And looks like my connection. Hello?
Yes, Prof. We missed what you were saying. Just go back by about 30, 40 seconds. Just share your thoughts with us again.
Sure. So there needs to be equity between domestic and foreign creditors, official and commercial creditors as well. But for me, going forward, we need to build our exchange rate reserves, tackle corruption because we lose a lot of money to corruption, and then also reform our institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining the conversation. We had Seth Thekpe, former Minister of Finance. We also had Dr. Theo Champong, a political risk analyst, and Professor Eloquent Agboyo, Professor of Finance at the University of Ghana Business School. Gentlemen, we're very grateful that you took the time to join us this morning on this conversation on the AM show.
You are welcome. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
So moving on from here, we're going to be contemplating genetically, modified organisms, GMOs, as we call them, and what the Peasant Farmers Association is saying on the back of that. They're up in arms. They feel this is a threat, and they are unhappy with the promotion of same. We'll be bringing you that discussion up next on the AM show. Do stay.